Hey, I'm good. How are you?
Good, good.
All right, well, I do have 12:02, so we will go ahead and get started for this afternoon session. Thanks, everybody, for joining today. My name is Duane Breijak. I'm the Director of Member Services at NASW-Michigan, and hopefully you're in the right place. Today we are going to talk about how to get your license in Michigan, and by the end of this hour and 15 minutes probably, we will have hopefully all of your questions answered and have you get set for that process post-graduation. Before we get rolling into the content, I'm just going to launch a quick poll just to see who's on today and which exam you are likely going to take, hopefully here in the near future. So if you would just go ahead and choose your option, that will give me some guidance of who we've got on the call today. I'll give folks about 10 more seconds.
Did you get my response, Duane? Derek?
I can't see who individually responded, but looks
Okay.
like almost everybody has completed that so far.
Okay.
All right. So not surprisingly, the bulk of you are clinical. So about 80% of the folks on the call so far are planning to take a clinical exam, 10% the generalist, and the other 10% the bachelor's. That's just helpful kind of to steer a little bit of the conversation today. What I'm going to talk about generally is going to apply to everybody. The process is the same regardless of which test or which particular license you'll be applying for, but some of the details will vary once we get to the exam itself. So before we roll into the content, just quick couple things about NASW if you're not a member. So we're going to talk about the licensure process today. We're going to do a brief overview of the exam itself. We know that that's a whole subset of questions that people generally have. We'll weave in some career resources as well as talk about salary negotiation, because when we talk about this exam process, none of it is generally free, but I'm hoping that by the end of this session that you will all come away with some ways to negotiate these into your contracts or your jobs post-graduation, and to make sure some of this gets covered if at all possible. And then since I work at NASW, obviously I'm going to weave in a little bit about us as an organization. If you're not a member, I highly recommend you join, especially as a student. It's a much cheaper rate. You can go to socialworkers.org if you want to learn a little bit more about that. But NASW, we're the largest organization for social workers on the planet, about 120,000 members across the United States. So I know one thing for students is that a lot of times you're transitional, so you may be moving after graduation. Some of you might be out-of-state students who came into Michigan for school, even though you might be in a virtual platform now. Your membership is a dual membership into the national organization and into a state chapter. So if you move at any time throughout your professional career, that state chapter will kind of follow you across the country. We also have chapters in Guam, Puerto Rico, the Virgin Islands, and an international chapter. So if you end up doing global social work, that will kind of follow you into those capacities there. One of the biggest things I think as a student that you can do to help your career out now is build your social work network up. So especially because we are in this kind of strange virtual environment where in-person events aren't happening, or at least very rarely in small capacity, we have this unique opportunity to connect online and digitally. And there are some ways to do that through various platforms. Obviously, there are lots of social media groups that are out there for social workers, lots of Facebook groups specifically. Hopefully you're a part of our Michigan Social Work Student Facebook page. If you're not, please join that. It's a good way to connect with students across the country. Michigan has a lot of social work students. We have 6,500 students across the state alone, 4,000 of them bachelor's level and 2,500 of them master's level students. So one of the things that as you approach graduation, especially if your graduation is next month in December, you should be thinking, how many people do I know outside of my program? And if the answer is 0, you've got a tiny bit of time, or maybe for some of you a little bit more time, to really expand that bubble within the social work profession. Because when you talk to people in the field about where did you get your job, it's generally not, I went online and did a job search. Most of the time it's because I knew somebody, or somebody referred me to this position, or maybe I was volunteering somewhere or interning somewhere and then a position opened up. You know, half of our professional title is social, and that means we have to be networked and resourced as well. And NASW is just another tool to do that. There's some other resources that will be very helpful as you continue throughout your career, whether it's news and information, practice updates, lots of advocacy. Actually, there was an advocacy alert that went out this morning, if you remember, around water. So please take some action on that. Check out that email from Algeria. Ethics and legal guidance, malpractice information, and then what we're doing today, kind of the career resources, whether that's licensure help, exam prep, job boards, resume and cover letter editing, all those sort of things that are so critical for you all who are entering the field. Please feel free to type any questions you have into the chat box today. I may open up lines later, a little bit later, and if I don't respond to any questions immediately, probably because it will be brought up a little bit later in the presentation. I will re-put the link for the handouts in there a little bit later, just in case anybody joined after that link was already put in there. So let's get into the licensure process here in Michigan. So Michigan was the second to last state in the whole United States to get a licensure bill passed, and it wasn't until 2005 that that happened. Which put us really far behind kind of the national curve for licensure, and a lot of it was political. We just didn't have the right folks in office here that would pass a licensure bill. So in 2005, we got kind of 3 things passed at the same time. We got the actual license, which allows you to practice. We got a defined scope of practice, which is kind of this grid document that says this is what you can do with a social work degree and a license after graduation. And it gave us title protection, which means in order to call yourself or work as a social worker, you have to have a license to practice. So if after graduation you decide to get a job in a kind of a tangential field or a non-social work related field that does not require that you have a license, and you choose not to get a license, that's great. I hope it's a fantastic job, but you cannot call yourself a social worker. That's actually a felony misrepresentation to do that. Like somebody pretending to be a doctor or practice medicine without a medical license. So the license is directly tied to that title that we hold. And partially that's why you're getting this degree, right? You're paying a lot of money to be in school, virtual school right now. And so we want to make sure that those terms are also tied into what we're doing in our education. So why we have a license to begin with is it protects our clients at the end of the day. It means that if a client is assigned a social worker or goes to see a social worker, that has a specific set of skills behind it. And so it's not just you have a BSW or an MSW degree. It means you've also had to do a certain number of hours in the field under supervision and pass an exam. So the ultimate goal of our license is to protect our clients, and it also gives the public, i.e. our clients, a way to file a complaint if there is some problem with services being provided. So it's really critical that we have a license. Before 2005, anybody in the state of Michigan could hold the job title social worker. They didn't even have to have a degree in social work and could have that title. Now that's a little bit different. So one of the pieces of advocacy that you all can bring back today is if you hear people calling themselves a social worker, but you know they don't have a social work degree or a license, that you can bring that back to them. You know, I know a lot of times this happens at internships where you may have somebody at the organization with a psychology degree who says, oh yeah, I'm a social worker. No, actually you're not. You might be a case manager or something other title, but the title social worker is reserved for you all who are going to be getting that license after graduation. And it's kind of up to all of us within the field to be able to take that advocacy out into the public. Because a lot of times we have to educate our HR department, educate our employers, and we don't want people misusing our titles. So that piece really can be brought back with all of you on this call today. before you apply for your license, you want to ask yourself a couple of things. So if for the few bachelor's level students on the call today, if you're planning to get your MSW, it's really a question about when are you getting your MSW. If you're going directly into your master's program after your bachelor's, you likely do not need to get a bachelor's level license, because any hours that you're working through your internship for your MSW will not count to your bachelor's level license. And unless you're planning to work a job outside of your internship that is a social work position, you would not need to have a license. If you're going to take a couple of years off in between your bachelor's and your master's level, you absolutely may want to get your license in that capacity. A lot of times people want to get some experience in the field before going on to their MSW. So if you're planning to work in a social work position, you may want to get your bachelor's level license. You likely won't finish the process because it takes a minimum of 2 years to go from a limited to a full license. So what would happen is if you start your LLBSW and then you start your MSW program, you would most likely just let your license lapse once you start your master's program, because you're going to start a new licensure process once you finish your MSW degree. The second question everyone on here wants to kind of think about is, are you staying in Michigan? If the answer is no, it's really critical that you do some research about what the licensure rules are in the state you plan to. All right, I think I'm back. Can folks hear me? Great. All right, don't know what happened there. That's very weird. Welcome to virtual world, but we're back. So what I was saying, just in terms of if you're planning to move, or if you do move at some point throughout your early career, make sure that you're connected to the licensure resources in that particular state. And if you're planning to move now, or if you know before graduation that you're going to move, let's just say to Ohio, for instance, they have a different set of rules for new professionals than we do in Michigan. They don't have the same credentials, so you wouldn't have an LLMSW or an LLBSW if you went to Ohio. They have different letters after their name, so that's where it can get a little bit confusing if you are planning to move, or if you end up moving during your early career. So I say contact the NASW chapter in that state first. Say, I'm a Michigan member, I'm looking to move to whatever state that you're planning to move to. Can you provide me with the best resources to get my license in whatever state? Because it is going to look a little bit different place to place. So Amanda just asked, can someone licensed in Michigan do telehealth for clients not residing in Michigan? So that is a tricky question. In COVID world, the answer is yes. There has been some rule flexibility with COVID that does allow us temporarily to see clients in other places, but it really depends on each state's rules around that. So what you want to do is ASWB has a really good part of their website, aswb.org, where you can look specifically state by state how rules have changed during the pandemic and what the current rules is. My guess is at some point once the pandemic wraps up, well, who knows when that will be, but what will likely happen is we will revert back to some policies that we had before, which was generally you have to be licensed in the state your client is located in. So many social workers end up having dual licenses or multiple licenses. There is a lot of work being done on some sort of national reciprocity, although my guess is that still is years away. But you have to generally be licensed in the state where your client is located in. So that's just one thing to keep in mind as we continue to work in this virtual setting, that some of those rules may flux a little bit over the next year. So just make sure to keep track of those sort of things. In Michigan, we have 3 license types. We have the bachelor's level, the master's level, and the associate's degree level. Everybody on this call will either be going for their LLBSW or their LLMSW. And at the bachelor's level, we just have one designation, the limited license Bachelor's of Social Work. At the master's level, we have 2 options, the clinical or the macro practice. And macro practice is also known as advanced generalist, so you might see those terms interchanged. When you apply for your license, you do have to choose which option you want to go for. And really that should be based off of what the work that you're doing in your job after graduation is. So it doesn't matter if you, honestly, from the state side, it doesn't matter if you were in a macro track or a clinical track. It really just matters what that first job after graduation is, which will determine what limited license category you should be in. And when you're listing out your credentials, you should specifically have your designation listed. So it should say LLMSW-clinical or LLMSW-macro. Many folks do not have their particular designation listed, and that is incorrect because the designation actually tells a client, an employer, what you're able to do. If you just have LMSW or LLMSW, it kind of leaves it very open, and so somebody doesn't know. You could be working outside of your defined scope of practice. So, for example, for me as a macro licensed person, I cannot do psychotherapy. So if I just had LMSW listed on my credentials, most folks would assume that I'm clinical, right? But that's not the case in Michigan. We have both licenses, and we'll talk about how you can get both licenses at the end. But make sure you're listing those credentials full out when you start your career. So as we go through the licensure process, there really is about 5 to 6 steps that most of you will have through this process. And in the handouts that I included earlier, and I'll put those into the chat box again, you'll find there's a handout specifically for this. It's just the checklist for the licensure process. So the first step you'll be done with at the end of today. You're learning about the process and the steps for licensure. In Michigan, we have 3 key players. We have LARA. They are the Licensing and Regulatory Affairs Office through the state of Michigan. LARA is the end-all, be-all for the licensure process. LARA is where you're going to go to apply for your license. They're who you go through if you need to change your address or your name. They're who you're going to renew for the rest of your life or your professional career. So LARA is the key player in the state of Michigan. NASW, we do this sort of thing. We do the advocacy, we do the education, the social work gathering. And then the third key player is ASWB. ASWB is your exam people. So those are the folks that write and administer the exam. You have to know about them, and hopefully just one time you'll have to know about them. After today, the next step is to get to graduation. So for folks who are on the call, would you just type into the chat box when your graduation date is? All right, looks like a pretty mix of mostly spring 2021 or maybe some January 2021s as well. So really, whatever your particular date for graduation is, I say 2 weeks before graduation in your calendar, you should write mail in licensure application 2 weeks before whatever your specific date is. Because what that application process is going to look like is it's a 3-step process here, you can see. You're going to actually go to the LARA website and print off the application. It's not very long, it's only 4 or 5 pages. You are going to fill that out, You're going to choose your designation, you know, LLBSW, LLMSW Clinical, LLMSW Macro. You'll mail that in to Laura with a money order or check for $43.20. Then you will wait until they have processed it and created an account for you. Once they have done that, you will get a letter back in the mail saying we've received your application. Here's a login for our website. You're now eligible to go get your fingerprints taken and have your transcript sent. Only once you get that letter back from Laura saying they've created an account for you can you have your fingerprints taken and your transcript sent, because otherwise there's no place for it to go at the state if they don't have an account yet. So once you get that, you can go to somewhere local. They'll send you a link of places across the state. Fingerprinting is roughly $75. If you have taken fingerprints recently for whatever reason, you do have to get them redone for this. And then your university or your school of social work will have to send in your final transcript. So I see Kelsey just wrote, is there a way to pay online with Laura or does it have to be checked? No, Laura does not have any online options for first-time licensees. If you already have your LLBSW, the process is still the same, yep. So it'll just be a little bit easier for you all who already have a license because you went through this once. So you kind of know the waiting game sometimes that this happens. And the reason I say to send it in a couple weeks before graduation, and you don't really want to go too much further than that because you don't want an account just to be sitting at the state with no further activity. So you don't want to send it in 5 months in advance and then fingerprints don't happen until months and months and months later, or your transcripts don't happen until months and months and months later. A couple weeks usually gives you time to actually graduate and it'll be processed, because by the time you mail it, they review it, they create an account, it'll probably take somewhere between 2 and 4 weeks for that to happen. And what we find is sometimes the holdup for folks is that transcript piece, because some universities or schools take a few weeks after official graduation to actually have your final transcripts in. So you just kind of want to know from your university's end what that process tends to look like, because that could be the holdup of when you actually get your limited license at the end of the day. For you folks who are clinical on this call, this is going to be probably the most potentially problematic for you all, because clinical positions generally will not hire you until you have your LL in hand, because that basically means they can hire you as a social worker and bill under you, which is really critical. So what I recommend is, as you're applying for positions, even if it's starting now, you know, it's not too early for you who are graduating in the springtime to start looking at applying for jobs. They may not hire you yet, but in your cover letter or your email to an organization, just being very upfront with that. Say, you know, I'm graduating in January or I'm graduating in April with my MSW. I will be applying for my limited license. By the time I'm hired into this position, I should have my limited license, or I anticipate having my limited license by X date. And that just hopefully gets you into the door for an interview, because many organizations will not even interview you until you have those credentials after your name. So what you want to do is just be as upfront as possible. And if for some reason you've applied for a position and you have not heard anything back and you did not have your limited license, you may want to consider reapplying. And once you have it, and just make sure those credentials are added. And you can also just tweak your cover letter and resume saying, you know, I applied earlier this winter or in the springtime. At that time, I did not have my limited license because I had not graduated. I do at this point. I'm still interested in the position. So just being as upfront as you can, because really the goal is to get you into the interview first. So again, this first process is you're going to fill out that application, you're going to get your fingerprints taken, and have your transcripts sent. Once you have asked your university to email over the transcripts, and this is something you can also research ahead of time, because some schools will send transcripts for free, some have a small charge, so it may just be a good idea to look into what your particular school of social work does right now, just so you have a heads up of what that cost might look like. There are lots of fingerprinting locations all across the state. Laura will send you a link to where you can go and find the one that's closest to you or the most convenient once you apply. So once those three things happen, you will get your limited license in the mail. What I highly recommend doing, though, is as soon as you know that you've got your fingerprints taken, the fingerprinting agency will send your fingerprints right to the state for you. You don't have to do anything around that. And then your university or your school will send your transcripts also independently from you. But once you have requested that from your school of social work and you know that they're probably going to be sending it in the next couple of days, I would go online to your LARA account and check every day whether your licensure application has been approved. Because you'll see online that you will have your limited license probably a week or two before you actually physically get the copy in the mail. And as soon as you see that that license has been approved online, you can add those credentials into your resume, into your signature line of your email. And then once you get the physical copy in the mail, that's just like an added bonus. But as soon as it is active online, that means you are good to go and you have your limited license. One of the things that you will also need at some point within your first year of your limited license is to obtain a training in human trafficking. I'm not going to go really into details on that today. There is a handout in the folder around that, so just make sure you look through that because you will have to attend a training around that. You may have already completed it if you did one in your schooling. Sometimes that can count as well, but make sure you just read through that document to get some clarification on that. Bobby just asked, so there's not a test to take to get a limited license? No, there's not. Nope, the limited license is just the application, fingerprinting, and transcripts. Monica, if we have time at the end, I'll get into more human trafficking, but the human trafficking, at least as of right now, is just a one-time ever training that will likely be changed in the next year to be a continuing education. So be on the lookout for that, but as of today, it's just a one-time and you're done with it. Once you get your limited license in the mail, or once it's approved online, that means you can actually start counting your hours. And to go from a limited license to a full license, it's 3 steps. It's working, under supervision, and passing the exam. Those are the 3 steps you need to do to go from your limited to your full license. Your limited license is on a 1-year renewal. It's $25 per time you renew it, and you can renew your limited license a total of 6 times. So if you're going back to back to back to back, you could have roughly 7 years, that's your 6 renewals, to complete this part of the process. What does work mean? So work is any social work experience so that fits within your specific scope of practice. So paperwork can count, going to trainings can count, direct client interaction can count, advocacy can count, political engagement can count. Anything that is directly related to your social work job counts towards work hours. You have to get 4,000 hours of supervised work, which sounds like a large number, but really what that means is 2 years full time. So if you're working part-time or if you're in a social work position that isn't kind of a calendar year, like a school social work position, it may take you a little bit more than 2 years, but generally it takes folks about 2 to 2.5 years to complete their 4,000 hours. While you're working, you need to be under supervision by a fully licensed social worker, and this is whether you're an LLBSW or you're an LLMSW. You have to be under supervision by an LMSW, and that needs to be 1 hour per week as long as it takes you to get your 4,000 hours. So if 4,000 hours is 2 years full time, you will roughly have to get 104 hours of supervision. So 52 weeks a year times 2 years. So it may take you a little bit different depending on how your social work journey is after graduation. And we anticipate, obviously there are vacations, there are times you're sick, so there may be weeks that you don't have supervision, but roughly it's going to take you, 2 years to complete this process. You should look at supervision as professional mentoring. If someone's job at your organization is, their title is supervisor and their main role is just to review cases with you on a weekly basis, that's not this person. This person, that may also be this person, but this supervision should really be somebody who's walking you through ethical dilemmas, advocacy arenas, getting you connected to the field of social work. They should be working through, are you having issues at your workplace? Do you need mentoring? How do you move up the ladder within your organization? All of those really important things as a new professional you want this person to be. Supervision can be up to 50% group. So roughly 2 of the 4 hours per month could be group supervision. The other 50% does have to be individual supervision. And this is also a critical thing to be thinking about as you apply or accept positions, whether or not supervision is included and or reimbursed. Because supervision can be free if an employer pays for it or reimburse you for it, but it's not always the case. You know, many social workers work in organizations where they're the only social worker, or maybe the social workers who are on staff don't have the capacity to supervise limited license folks. And so if you need to contract somebody out, you can absolutely do that, but likely there's a charge. It's on average around Michigan, we see $40 to $50 per hour if you are contracting somebody out. So if you can get it covered by your organization, that is the number one that we recommend for that. Because it could get costly, and especially you want to negotiate that in early into your social work career if you can. Your supervisor, if you are getting your LMSW, needs to have the designation that you are going for. So if you are going for your clinical license, your supervisor has to have a clinical license, macro. I'll give one example of this. I work at NASW. I have a macro license. I supervise 2 limited licensed social workers who have their LMSW macro outside of my role at NASW. They work in different organizations. Their organizations do not have other social workers that exist there that can do supervision. Actually, there are no social workers that work where they work. And so they contract out me to be able to meet with them. We meet twice a month group, twice a month individual. That can be virtual. So you can, as of right now, we primarily do either phone or Zoom sessions. But, you know, generally, at least for us, we, in the past, tend to meet up at like a Big B or a Starbucks to do our supervision. But really whatever works best for you. Your supervisor does not have to have sorry, I got distracted with a question. So with your supervision, when you're thinking about reimbursement, this is a really important question. So when you start a job after graduation, and if they do not have a supervisor, do you have to pay that as an individual limited licensee out of your own pocket, or does the organization reimburse that, right? Because let's just say $50 an hour, that's $200 a month if you're paying that amount, which then will be roughly $5,000 over the course of the year. As a new social worker, that's a lot of money coming out of your pocket. So you want to make sure that you've negotiated that into your contract before you accept that position. And if you are working in a non-traditional setting, this may mean you have to do a little bit more advocacy on your own, because your organization may not understand why you need to get licensed or what the benefit will that be to them long term. So sometimes we have to do a little bit more work on our end, especially for the macro folks on this call. Your supervisor does not have to have any additional training, which is sometimes problematic because we do not have a requirement in Michigan that supervisors have to have gone through any sort of supervision training. So there's a mixed bag of what supervision looks like out there. But I highly recommend that you want to make sure that somebody is somebody who you really want to be a mentor from. Because if you think about this, this is somebody you're going to have a relationship with for 2 years, at least, because you're going to meet with them likely for every month, assuming you're in that same position. And when I look at supervision as, it really is like professional therapy almost, because you're talking about workplace issues, right? You're talking about maybe there's some problematic people at your organization, or there's drama within your workplace, or you're dealing with ethical dilemmas, or you're really trying to figure out, you have personality issues at your organization, or you're trying to move up the organizational ladder and try to build your career there. You want to have somebody who can walk through all of that with you that you're comfortable talking with. And you can always switch up supervisors if you want throughout your limited license time. Just make sure you document that. All that the state is going to require, all that Laura will require once you complete your 4,000 hours, is that your supervisor or your supervisors fill out what's called a verification form. And that's really just like a 1 or a 2-page form that says, I worked with this person from this date to this date for this many hours. And as long as those hours add up to that 4,000 that you need, you're good to go. However, you as a limited licensee need to have further documentation. So what we do with my supervisees is we have a monthly log that I sign. So when they pay me every month, we complete that log that says we met this date, this date, this date, this date for this amount of time. And that just gives them a backup in case anything happens, because things do happen, right? Supervisors move, maybe somebody gets fired from a job and then that relationship is terminated and you're not allowed to talk to them. Somebody could pass away. And if you don't have any backup documentation, you could really screw yourself over. I'll give one example of that. We had a social worker, a limited licensee, who was at like year 6 of their limited license renewal. They had just completed their hours and they were getting ready to turn in all their paperwork, and their supervisor passed away. And that supervisor was the only social worker at that organization, and there was nobody else that could verify that that had happened for several years. So that particular limited licensee really did kind of like screw themselves over by not having some additional documentation as backup, because the state may take those things into account if there is an extreme circumstance, right? And we would just want to make sure that you all have that as backup. You can go to the NASW-Michigan website, and we have a supervision area where you can locate supervisors that we've trained that offer supervision services, but there's also templates for like a weekly log, some conversation starters, as well as a templated contract, because all of you should have a contract with your supervisor, even if it is somebody that is provided by your organization. Because again, this should lay out how often are you paying them, how often are you meeting, do you require that both parties have liability insurance? Is your supervisor required to sign off on your paperwork if by the end of your hours they don't think you're ethically ready to practice? So we have a template for that that you can use, but that also then gives you a backup if some reason your supervisor goes MIA and you need to just have some additional documentation. Stephanie asked a good question. What happens if someone renews 6 times and still doesn't fulfill the requirements for their LMSW? So if you've gone all 6 renewals or 7 years and you haven't completed your work, your supervision, or your exam, you actually cannot get licensed in the state of Michigan any longer. You've maxed out the amount of renewals that you're ever able to have here. So if you're not collecting hours, you do not have to renew your license consecutively. So if something happens after a year out in the field, maybe you have a kid, you move, whatever, taking care of somebody, and you're not working, you do not have to renew your limited license. So just don't. You can, if you went 1 year, if you renewed once and then needed to take 2 years off, then you still have 5 more renewals banked up waiting to be used later on. Just don't continue to renew unless you're collecting hours. And your hours, the state does mandate that you have to be working a minimum of 16 hours for it to count. So if you're working part-time less than 16 hours, you may not want to continue to renew your limited license because it has to hit that minimum threshold of 16 hours to count. And you can at the maximum count 40 hours a week. So even if you're working more than 40 hours a week, the state will only allow you to count 40 hours towards your licensure. The template for the supervision contract is on the NASW-Michigan website, so you can just go there at any time and find that. It's under our Find a Supervisor tab. And Hillary asked, can you have more than 1 supervisor at a time? Absolutely, you can. You can't count more than 1 hour per week on average. So we know that things happen and you may have a week here or there that you missed that you need to make up for, or maybe your supervisor takes you to a conference or an event and you're working a couple of hours 1 week or a couple of weeks a year that are going to be more than 1 hour. That's okay. You shouldn't be getting 4 hours 1 time a month. That's not how this is supposed to go. It's supposed to be 1 hour on average per week, as long as this takes you to get. But yeah, you could have more than 1 supervisor. Yeah, you just want to make sure that's documented. So you may have 1 supervisor that's doing 2 hours a week, another supervisor or a month, and another supervisor that's doing the other 2 hours. Especially, many social workers have multiple positions, right? So you may be working part-time at one job, part-time at another job, and you have a supervisor for each particular position. Or you could have one supervisor that oversees both of those jobs and maybe is not connected to either one like I do for my folks. So yeah, you can have absolutely more than one supervisor. Or if your supervisors change over time, that's perfectly fine too. You know, people leave their positions for whatever reason, or if you move and can no longer see that particular supervisor, absolutely. Just make sure that when you end that relationship, even if you haven't completed all 4,000 hours, you have that supervisor at that time complete that verification form for you. So the other piece to this section that some of you may fit into, depending on when your graduation is as of right now, you do not have to have your hours complete to be able to sit for your exam. So starting next July 1, you have to have all of your 4,000 hours complete before you can take your exam. So if you are graduating this winter in December or January, or I would say probably up until folks who are graduating by the end of April, maybe early May, you may have an opportunity to sit for your exam before all of your hours are complete. And why I say May, especially for the people who are in the spring, is remember it's going to take 2 to 5 weeks to even get your limited license after graduation. And then at that point, you have to still schedule a time to take your exam. So if you're graduating in May, it's maybe going to give you a week or two once you get your limited license to actually schedule your tests. And that's assuming there's testing sites available at that time. So it's going to be a really close crunch for the people who are graduating in the springtime. If you're an April graduate, you may have a little bit more wiggle room, but still going to be pretty tight. You probably will only have the month of June to be able to sit for your exam. Yeah, so Sarah, yeah, June 30th is the date. So July 1 would be the first day that people need to have all of their hours complete. Haley asks, best thing we can do if we're May to give ourselves a shot. So the best thing you can do is make sure you have all your ducks in a row. So make sure you have sent in your application for your limited license 2 weeks before graduation. Have your fingerprinting location more or less lined up, at least know where that's going to be or where you plan to have as soon as Laura has set up an account for you, and make sure that you send your university a request to send over their transcripts as soon as you are able to from the state. The tricky part is some universities won't have your transcripts finalized until 3 to 4 weeks after graduation either. So sometimes it really is just a waiting game. And if you want to try to get into that wiggle room of the month of June, you can also just make sure that you are starting to prep for that exam. So studying at least by the end of the springtime. So that's just one thing that you want to take a little bit of caution on for the spring folks. For those of you who are a little bit later, you're just going to be in this boat where you have to have your hours complete before you can sit for your exam. And we'll talk about some licensure prep courses before we end today as well. Amanda, I see you're having issues finding that on the website. So it's going to be under the member benefits, find a supervisor tab is where all of those resources are going to be. So once you complete your hours, your supervision, and your exam, you still have to apply for your full license. That's another $43.20, and your supervisors have to send in that verification form. So that's going to be your final step in order to move from your limited to your full license. Once you get your full license, that's when your continuing education requirements start. And so while you're limited, you do not need continuing education. However, if it takes you 6 renewals to get your full license, please take some continuing education because there's a lot that changes in our field within 7 years' time. But once you get that full license, it's 45 hours of continuing education over those 3 years. Your full license is a 3-year renewal, not a 1-year. So during that 3-year cycle, you have to get 5 hours of ethics, 2 hours of pain management, and likely sometime in the next couple of months, so by the time you all have your full license, there will be human trafficking, likely 2 human trafficking CEs that are added. But make sure that you follow NASW and what else is going on in the field during the next couple of years to make sure if there are any changes that you just know of those. If you want to get the second designation, you need to basically do half the requirements. So if you are the clinical license and you want to add the macro or vice versa, it's half, basically 1 year of full-time work in that area under supervision and passing the second exam. You will have to request permission from Laura to sit for that second exam. So you'll have to call or email them saying, you know, I'm a clinically licensed social worker. I want to sit for my macro exam to add that designation on, and they should do that no problem. If you all as limited licensees have issues scheduling your exam, or you go to the ASWB website and it says you're not eligible to sit for your exam, likely what that means is Laura did not give you the right permission on your account. And so all you need to do is call Laura or email Laura and say, hey, I'm trying to apply for my exam. It says I do not have permission. They should just be able to do that over the phone or really quickly for you. Couple of questions. Is there a charge for changing your name? No, there should not be a charge for that. Stephanie asked, is there a second application process for the second designation? You do have to complete. There is another $43.40 that basically just adds on that designation. I think it may actually be a little bit cheaper just to add the second designation on, but it's not a full application. You don't have to get re-fingerprinted, none of that stuff. All right. And Janan asked, I was under the impression that if you graduate with a macro, you cannot get licensed as a micro social worker. That is incorrect. The state does not care at all what your designation at the university level was. It's all about your first job or your jobs out of school and what you're doing. And then Christina asked, could you still work in macro positions without the macro designation? Depends on the job. If it requires a macro license, then no, you could not. Social work is an interesting field, right? We're heavily clinical. So all clinical jobs will require a license. Not all macro jobs will require a license. So that's just one thing to note. This particular recording will probably not be available. We do have a recording similarly on our YouTube channel, but all of the handouts in the folder should be everything you need. The checklist specifically should be the one document that runs through this in a really pared down format. So just make sure you check through those after we're done here today. All right. So before we just do a quick intro to the exam, I want to do a financial recap because this is really important to know about the potential money. And I have it broken down into like the happy face and sad face. So the happy face is the cheapest probable way that this will happen. This process will happen. So you've got your $43.20 for your initial application, your $75 for your fingerprinting. You'll have to renew your limited license one time at least to be that 2-year minimum. So that's $25. You'll have to take your exam. That's either $230 if you're bachelor's or $260 if you're master's. And you'll have to apply for your final license, $43.20. So that's going to be roughly $450 over a couple of years at the lowest end. And that is assuming that supervision is provided and you have not had to purchase any sort of test prep. However, this can get very expensive. So if you are on the sad face, you still got your initial application, your fingerprinting. If it takes you all 6 renewals, it'll be $150 versus $25. Your exam fee is however many times it takes you to pass the exam. So hopefully it's just one time, but there could be a couple of multiplications in there if that's the case. On average, I would say most folks spend between $200 and $300 on exam preparation. We'll talk about some options for that too in a minute. If your supervision is $50 an hour and you're doing roughly 100 hours of supervision, it's $5,000. Some supervisors charge up to a clinical hour, which is around $100 an hour. And so that could be up to $10,000 over 2 years. I would highly recommend not getting supervision if they charge that much money. There's plenty of folks who charge a lower amount. However, if your organization is reimbursing that cost, absolutely have that social worker charge the higher amount because they are using their time and their skills. But if you have to pay individually out of your pocket, you want it to be the lower amount. And then the final application, $43.20. So we went from about $500 to between $6,000 and $11,000, really because of the supervision piece. So it's really important that you all know whether or not supervision is included before you accept a position. Because if they don't reimburse it and it's not included, it may be a deal breaker. And if it is included, you can almost think of that as a fringe benefit to your job because they're adding that additional financial burden or taking away that potential financial burden for you all. All right, so that's kind of the financial recap. I see Sarah has another question. Is fingerprinting required if we already have been fingerprinted under an LLBSW? That's a really good question, Sarah. That kind of has gone back and forth. So what I would recommend is calling Laura if you are in that boat and just seeing what they say. We've heard somewhat mixed things on that over the last couple of years, so I would just verify with them what is required. Once you submit your LMSW paperwork, I would call them at that point because it's going to take a couple of weeks to process and just say, I've applied for my limited license at the master's level. I already have my LLBSW. Do you need me to get re-fingerprinted? Hopefully not, because that would save you a little bit of money, but knowing how the state works, I would not be very surprised if they added that in there. All right. Some career resources besides the general supervision resources that are on the other NASW-Michigan website. There are also lots of career resources, including job databases. We have a professional development booklet, which walks through resume and cover letter samples. Also information on Skype interviewing. You know, as we move in more and more into virtual interviews, I think we just have to be prepared. That's going to be the norm for a while. There's lots of good stuff on our website, both on ours and the national site. Andrew asked a question. If we sit for the exam before June 30th and do not pass, do we need to wait until all of our hours are complete to retake it? Andrew, my understanding is yes. So for those of you who are graduating in December or January, I would highly recommend trying to take your exam early in February or maybe by mid-February, because you have to wait 90 days in between when you can take the exam a second time. So if for those folks who have the ability, you may have an option, if absolutely necessary, to take it twice before now and June. But for most folks, it'll likely just be a one opportunity for the springtime. Okay, so I know that was already a lot of information. Are there any questions before I move just briefly into the exam? And feel free to unmute your line or just type them into the chat box.
I actually have another question.
Yeah.
So I wanted to know if I'm going in as macro and I have somebody who supervises me as macro and I do that for 2 full years, would I be able to then submit for licensure as clinical and have a supervisor under clinical? And if I do that, you know, I mean, if I'm doing them as separate licenses, I still have, if I don't apply for one, I can still have that span of 7 years?
So if you have went your 2 years working under a macro supervisor with that experience, what would happen is you would complete that whole license. So you would just get your macro license. And then to add in the second designation, it's not as strict. They don't have a 6-year time cap for adding the second designation. So all that would happen once you complete either the clinical or the macro designation one time is you would just then start working in the other area, or if you're working maybe half time as in clinical work under supervision, you would just submit all of those hours and then request to take that second exam at some point once you want to, after you complete the one. But you have to complete the whole pot of 1 hours before you can start collecting hours in the other area, if that makes sense.
Thank you.
My question is, I'm going to start my MSW right away after the BSW program. There's literally like 30 days in between, but I do intend to work through the master's program. So do I not need to have the limited license for the BSW? Is that not a thing?
So it's going to depend on what you mean by work in between or during. So if you plan to work in a social work job that's outside of your internship during your MSW program, you likely would need to have your LLBSW. But if you're just working in some other sort of fashion during that time, you would not need to have it.
Okay, thank you.
Question from, it looks like Alex, any chance they will push that date back again due to COVID? No, unfortunately not. That was a date set by ASWB like several years back. So Michigan was just one of the last states to get to follow those rules. We've been pushing it back as long as humanly possible. So unfortunately not. All right, so let's just switch a little bit into the exam. So the ASWB exam is a national exam. You take it at a Pearson testing site. So when you get ready to schedule your exam, you'll go to aswb.org. You will pay your $230 or $260, and then you will get emailed a link to schedule your specific site and time at a Pearson testing site. Those locations are there's quite a few of them across the state of Michigan. You also don't need to take it in Michigan, so if you end up being somewhere else for the time being, you could take your exam anywhere in the United States. Every state uses the ASWB exam, so as long as you schedule the right sort of test, clinical, advanced generalist, or bachelor's, you'd be fine to take that wherever. The test is 170 questions, only 150 count. So there are 20 questions that are being tested for future tests. So you don't know which 20 those are. Hopefully they're all the ones you got wrong. But of the 170, of the 150 that count, you have to get roughly a 75% pass rate, passing score. And so roughly is a key word because every test is weighted differently. So they have monitored every single question that is in their database based off of how many people get that right or wrong. And so they've determined a point value. So your particular passing score will be somewhere likely between a 70% and an 80% out of that 150 that count. So when you're studying, you want to be getting an 80% regularly as a passing score when you're studying for this. You get 4 hours to take the test. On average, it takes between 2.5 and 3 hours. So it's a long test. I highly recommend that you at least do one full sit-down run through of a practice exam because you'll at least know what that feels like. The test itself is probably the best part of this exam is you are notified right at the end whether you've passed or not. So what will happen is you'll get to question 170 and you'll see the submit button in the corner and you'll be really tentative to push that submit button, but you'll hit it and then it will say, are you really sure you're done? And it'll ask you like 3 times. So your anxiety will be pretty high at this point and you'll be done and then you finally click done. And then you think you're done, but nope, because we're social workers, there's an 8-question survey. So you'll have to do a little survey and then it will either say congratulations or needs further study, something like that. So probably on that exam day, you may cry or cry depending on how it goes. It's a big test, right? Not a super fun test to take. Any standardized test is not great. But you do know before you leave that building if you passed it. If you did not pass the exam, you can get a detailed printout of which areas you need further study in. Highly recommend making sure you get that before you leave. If you pass, basically what they're going to do is give you a printout that just says you needed this score out of this score. At that point, you don't really care because you're just done. The testing site sends your score right to Laura for you. I see this question from Haley. If you need any accommodations, make sure you just make that known when you schedule your testing site. There's various accommodations that they will provide, so you just have to let them know and that shouldn't be a problem at all. You will do this all on a computer. So you'll get to your Pearson site. You'll basically be in a little cubicle. You'll get like a 5-minute demo, which will run you through the software. They give you generally a whiteboard and a marker or something that you can write with, but you're not allowed to really bring anything in with you. When you walk into the Pearson testing site, you'll get a locker. They'll scan your palms when they check you in, which was weird. I'd never seen that before. And then you're allowed to bring in a water bottle with no labels and no cap, and cough drops unwrapped on a blank piece of tissue paper. And that was pretty much all that they allow you to bring in. So how the rooms are set up is there's basically 3 walls of cubicles where you'll be taking your exam. Other people will be taking exams of other sorts of professions as well. I'm sure they're all COVID restricted now, so I'm sure everything is at least at 6-foot intervals. And then the other wall is a glass wall where there are monitors watching you or people watching you to make sure you have questions or if your technology goes out, or when you're done, they'll come and check your computer and make sure everything is all good. So it can be a little bit weird if you're not prepared for like people to be in there watching you the whole time, but there are folks who are watching during this time. This is also the potential problem that may happen with people who are scheduling their exams in May and June. There is going to be an influx of people trying to take their social work exams in Michigan this June and May because of this change going on nationally. So as early as you can try to schedule your test, which means you'll have to have your limited license, I would get your test scheduled then, because that may be one barrier to it. There may just not be testing sites available, or you may have to go somewhere that's a little bit further away than you would normally go because of capacity. Because these aren't just social work testing sites, they also test for any sort of health license in the state of Michigan. Question from Natasha, what's the difference between the 230 and 260? So the 230 is for the bachelor's exam, the 260 is for either of the master's level exams. And the exam should directly correlate with which license types you have. So if you are going for the LMSW clinical, you should be taking the clinical exam. If you are taking the advanced generalist, if you're going for the advanced generalist license or the macro license, then you will go for the advanced generalist exam. Do note that ASWB has a 3rd master's level exam option that Michigan does not use. So do not buy study materials that is for the master's exam. We do not use the master's exam in Michigan. We only use the clinical or the advanced generalist. So you're going to see some stuff out there that has that 3rd option. Don't buy that. I mean, it's not going to be super different, but that's not going to be directly correlated to what you're going to take yourself. The exam is going to traditionally ask a couple of things, either direct questions or give you some sort of cases. So, you know, direct question, what's the best drug used to treat schizophrenia? There will be psychopharmacology on the master's level exam, or there might be cases. You know, you're a school social worker working with a client with blah, 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 blah. What do you do first? So you want to look for that stem of the question. Where are they? Are they in a school? Are they in a hospital? Are they in an inpatient setting? And then what are those critical words? And so you will see these on almost every question. What should the social worker do first? Or what is the best treatment method for this client? You're going to kind of hate these questions at first, because when you see these particular words, it usually means there's 1, 2, 3, or 4 correct answers for that question. My biggest piece of advice for this exam is remember that this exam is a generalist test. So you have to know a little bit about everything in social work. You are not a domestic violence shelter worker in Detroit, Michigan. You are not a foster care worker in Lansing. You are a generalist practitioner anywhere in the United States. So your specific agency policy and rules around certain things is not going to be always the right answer. The general social work policy will be the answer for these questions. So I think of yourself as Jane Addams standing in the middle of a cornfield in Iowa, ready to do any sort of social work, ready, go. That's who you are. You're not your lens of a social worker right now through your internship or through your past work. You need to know a little bit about everything. And so when you're looking through these questions, especially if there are multiple correct answers, usually there is one that's a broader answer. And that's almost always the right answer, because it's going to encompass everything. And usually it will encompass all the rest of those correct answers. You will get questions around client safety and confidentiality. Everyone has questions around ethics. You can flag questions on your computer. Make sure that you fill in an answer for every question and then flag it if you want to come back to it, because you don't want to run out of time and realize you failed by one question, but you left 10 blank because you thought you would come back to it. Make sure you answered every question as you go through it. ASWB has content outlines. I've included those in the handouts links, so make sure you just download the one that's relevant to your particular exam, and that gives a breakdown specifically on your test, what percentages are in each topic area. And so when you're studying, you kind of go through and say, okay, I already feel confident in X, Y, Z, but I really need to hone in on this. I know for me as an individual, as a macro person, I need to focus on psychopharmacology and diagnosis. Those were my top two ones that I did not know that much on, because that's just not what I practice in. For other people, it's going to be different areas. So you're going to have some really strong strengths when you start studying for this exam, and then there'll be just a few areas where you want to make sure you hone into. The exam will look at three things: recall, application, and reasoning. If you're taking the bachelor's exam, you don't really have the reasoning sorts of questions, but the recall ones will mostly be descriptions and definitions. Applications will use rules, laws, and concepts. And then reasoning is more your judgment based. And we will do a couple of sample questions here that will go through a couple of these. So in terms of pass rates, so this might be something that all of you have all talked about as well. So this is a good amount of information on here, but what we know is at the bachelor's level, it's about a 70% pass rate across the board nationally for all three exams. The bachelor's and advanced generalists are 67% nationally for first-time test takers. The clinical exam is a little bit higher at 74%. In Michigan, we have a slightly higher pass rate for the bachelor's and the advanced generalists, but our clinical pass rate is slightly lower. We actually had a meeting yesterday with deans and directors from across the state to try to address some of this. So you'll probably all will start to see some stuff coming through your programs later this year. But we want to make sure that you are all in this first category of passing on the first time, because we know that for folks who need to take the exam multiple times, sometimes it can get significantly harder, because that's usually when anxiety pops in as well. So getting you through this the first time is really our goal across the state. And know what is available at your particular school of social work, because some schools have free tests you can take. Some schools have prep courses that are free or cheap. Some schools incorporate some content already into their field classes. Some schools don't do any of that. So it may be coming at some of your universities as well. But, 70% generally across the board is not a terrible pass rate for first-time test takers, but we want to make sure that it continues to grow. And we'll talk about a couple of study materials in just a minute. But in terms of, let's do a couple of sample questions. Question from Natasha: is there a limit on the number of times you can take the exam? The only limit is your 6th renewal maximum. So you have to wait 90 days in between each time you take the exam. So there's a lot of options if you went back-to-back 90 days. But on average, it takes folks just one time. There are folks who've had to take it more than that, obviously, but, I don't want that to be in your brain. Most folks are going to pass on the first, maybe second time. So let's do a couple of sample questions. And before you type anything into the chat box, we'll just go through a couple of reasoning for this. So this is a recall question. This is something you may see on a sort of question that you could see on the bachelor's or any of the master's exam. So the largest number of persons receiving public assistance in most states are single mothers, children less than 18, unemployed fathers, and aged individuals. So when you're studying for this exam, you really want to look at what are the key words in this question. And so what do you think some of the key words in this are? Feel free to type those into the chat box. Okay, so I'm seeing a couple of things. Most states obviously are important. We're looking for across the country, what is public assistance. Obviously, largest, we want to know who is the largest group receiving public assistance. So this is really a definitions question at the end of the day, and that what you're trying to define is what is public assistance. That is your two keywords, is public assistance in here. Because what may or may not count as public assistance? Does food stamps or SNAP count as public assistance? Does Social Security count as public assistance? Does Medicare and Medicaid count as public assistance? Because based off of that definition, that may skew how you view this question. So when I view public assistance, things like Social Security are not public assistance, at least in our definition of that. So when you think of aged individuals, you know, that's the largest growing area of the country, right? We know that that's also the largest growing area of social work because the population is aging, they need additional services. But programs like Social Security are not considered public assistance. So when we think about what actually would it count as public assistance, we think about maybe food stamps, SNAP benefits. So when we kind of narrow down some of those choices, what do folks think might be the correct answer to this question? I see some answers coming in. Looks like we got it down to A and B. So nobody said C, so we'll cross out unemployed fathers. So we're single mothers or children less than 18. So we've got it down to 2, and that's generally how you're going to study for this exam. You'll get it down to 2, and then you'll be like, okay, what realistically makes the difference between these two answers? And so I think math is, at the end of the day, what makes the difference between this particular test or this particular question, because single mothers can have more than one child, right? And so the correct answer is B. And it's actually about 75 to 80% of public assistance goes to children less than 18. So single mothers, we know that that's like the traditional, what is like stereotyped as on public assistance, the welfare queen, right? But really what we know from practice is children are primarily the ones who are on public assistance or the ones getting the public assistance, even if, you know, there may be one, obviously the one parent, but may have 3 or 4 children. So about 75% of public assistance goes to children. We'll do one more question. An 18-year-old college student in treatment for anxiety and depression at a college counseling service tells a social worker that a teacher made a sexual advance. As a result, she has become uncomfortable in his class. How should the social worker first respond? Suggest that the student report the teacher to a department head, indicate that the student dropped the course, ask the student to clarify the allegation and describe the teacher's behavior, or clarify the student's rights and the nature of the teacher's responsibility to students. So for this particular question, obviously the word first is in italics, so that's key. What would you do first in this particular situation? So what do we think on this one? Okay, looks like primarily C and D, so we've gotten rid of A and B. Those are good. Obviously, you're not going to probably first tell the student to drop the course. That may come a little bit later. Report this teacher to a department head. Again, that may not be the first thing you do, so we've got it down to C and D. Ask the student to clarify the allegation or clarify the student's rights. So when we look at what that really would look like in practice, C is basically saying get more information. D is saying, okay, I'm going to maybe go to the school handbook and then tell what is the process based off of the school. So as a social worker, generally what we do first is ask questions, right? Get more information. So C is the correct answer for this particular question. You may, after you get more information, then go to D, say, okay, it seems like your allegation is accurate. Let's see what the school policy is, and then we can move forward with there, and then it may go into something like you may want to drop the course or reporting the teacher later on. But the very first thing is get more information from the client. And this sort of question will be absolutely on your exam. It may be worded a little bit differently. It might be another scenario, but you will have a question that is directly going to ask you get more information from your client. So those are a couple of sample sorts of questions. on your day of your exam, make sure you know where you're going, because your time starts whether you are there on time or not. So make sure you're there on time. Make sure you have an ID that matches how you have registered for your exam. If you get divorced or married or something happens with your name, make sure that those names sync up before you get to that room, because you don't want to give them any reason to turn you away. And maybe the biggest piece of advice for this exam is the last bullet. If it doesn't say it, don't assume it. If you read a question and your brain immediately goes, wow, I just had that happen in my practice this week or in my internship over the summer. No, you didn't. Nope, different thing. All that we can infer from these questions are the 2 to 3 sentences that they give us information for. And so we just have to go basically what's off of there. So again, think about yourself in that general concept, not at your particular sort of job right now. And there's no magic button that you can push that says, I want 2 more sentences of information about this case. They have determined that very limited information is enough to answer the question. So you can only read what is in there. Don't assume anything else about any client interaction. Don't assume anything about the case. Just read what is on that particular question. This is not an exam you can wait to the very last second to study for. I hate to tell you that, but it covers so many different areas of social work that you really do have to take a while to study for it. You know, I recommend probably at least 2 months of studying, not every day, right? But you want to take a couple hours every week and slowly build up. Once you get closer to the date, you'll study a little bit more. There's lots of different options, so figuring out what works best for you. We're going to be looking at doing some sort of a virtual online study group or Facebook group or something for folks later this year as a way to connect folks across Michigan. There are some prep materials that can be helpful. So the first thing is go to your smartphone and just put in Social Work Exam into your app store and see what's there. There are specific ones for the bachelor's, the clinical, and the advanced generalist. Know that none of the apps are owned by ASWB, so the questions will not be 100% the same, but that will at least give you some starting point for studying. And usually they're cheap. Some of them are free. They range up to maybe like $10 or $15 at the most, but that's going to be cheaper than a prep course to get you rolling. Don't throw away your books after graduation. If you've got specifically Code of Ethics books, anything around diagnosis and theory, those are going to be the critical ones that you want to make sure to keep. And at the end of the day, you just want to see that congratulations on the screen. You don't get a raise generally if you pass this. You just want to see that congratulations at the end. We're going to be hosting 2 exam institutes, one in December and one in May. This is a good option if you're looking for a study material. Michigan State offers a couple of courses. I don't know if they've moved theirs online this year. I'd imagine they probably have, but they have one, and Michigan, U of M has an online prep course as well. So those are a couple of things to check out. Our course is a 1-day and includes a physical book. You get an online copy of the book, an app, and 60 days of an online learning platform, which also includes a national community of folks that you can learn from. And our book, there's only one advanced generalist book that exists in the world currently, and this is the one. Dawn Apgar, she's great. She's also the one who administers our course. So if you're interested in that, please feel free to check that out on the NASW-Michigan site. We also have partnered with an organization called Pass It Pro. It's an online learning system and exam prep. This one I find specifically works well for folks who have test anxiety and needs more one-on-one attention, maybe for those who have needed to repeat the test, because you can do tutoring, individual tutoring with an expert teacher there. And this was designed specifically by a non-traditional social worker who failed the exam once, and then she basically created a whole course for folks in that realm. So that's passitpro.com. So just a couple of resources that you can find there. But I highly recommend checking out with your particular university and seeing if they've got anything available, or even if your library may have some study books that you can rent out for free to get some sample tests. This is my contact information. We do post sample questions also on the NASW-Michigan Facebook from time to time, so please feel free to join that. Are there any other questions? I know this was a lot of information that I gave you all today.
Yes, Duane, will you be providing the PowerPoint for this today?
So the PowerPoint itself is not going to be available because you don't need it.
Okay,
What you really need is the checklist that is in the handout. That runs through, it's basically a limited version of the PowerPoint, but that gives you the step-by-steps that you need to get through the process.
okay, thank you.
We do have a version of this whole recording on our YouTube channel as well. So if you just want to go back and listen to it at some point, you could too.
Thank you.
Okay, Duane, I have a question.
Yeah.
Would they typically have a question about medications or something like that?
Yeah, psychopharmacology will pop up for the macro, or for both the clinical and the macro folks. The clinical folks will have more on that. It won't be tons of questions, but there will be psychopharmacology questions. So you do have to know kind of the common name for drugs as well as the psychopharmacology names of them.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Duane. Will you be providing us with a copy of the checklist? In
Yes,
case
it's
we,
in the handout for today. So if you go to the Google Drive in the chat box, it
Okay,
does a
down at
bunch
the
of
bottom.
research.
all right, thank you. Great presentation. We
Oh, you're
appreciate
welcome.
it.
All right, question from Alicia. If we take our exam before July 1, how soon after that do we need to start getting our hours? So you can start getting your hours the day you get your limited license. So you can have taken your exam or not taken your exam. You may have already started building some hours or you may not. You're not eligible to take your exam until you have your limited license. So that is, again, kind of the one barrier to that. So it looks like Susan just had a clarifying question. So the testing date, that was a policy change from ASWB. All of the state licensing boards have to make those changes at their state by July 1 of 2021. This was a policy that was changed in 2016 that gave basically 5 years for states to get on board, and Michigan chose to go the very last minute to do it.
I knew I had one more question. So how long are you allowed to have your limited license?
You can renew your limited license 6 times. So that if you renewed it consecutively, it would give you 7 years to complete all of that. But you don't have to renew it consecutively. So if you're not working, do not renew your limited license. Or if you're not collecting social work hours, do not renew your limited license. And that does happen. You know, people have kids, they move, may become a caregiver, they may just work in a different field for a short amount of time. And if you're not using collecting those social work hours, just make sure you're not.
Okay, so it's a total of 7 years.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
All right. Well, if
what
folks
was
have further questions, feel free to reach out to me at any time. And if you have other questions about NASW and how to get involved, please reach out. We're having our social justice and anti-racism committee meeting tonight at 5:30. So if folks are interested in joining that information is on our website as well. We're always wanting to get more and more people involved in activities across the state.
I just have a really quick question. What was the name of that YouTube video that you said is similar to the presentation today?
So if you go to NASW-Michigan's YouTube channel, you'll find it on there. There's a bunch of videos on there.
Okay.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Good luck with the rest of the semester.
Thank you.
Thank you.